Welcome to the Source Thurles. It is October 2020, and we are here tonight to mark the centenary of the death of Sean Treacy. Our speaker is Des Murnan, and the title of his talk is Sean Treacy, 1895 to 1920, A Life for Ireland.
In these extraordinary times, we're still better off than our ancestors were 100 years ago, when a war of independence was fought during a flu pandemic. Surely a more terrible situation than any COVID-19 scenario. It's important, whatever today's circumstances, that we continue to think and talk about the past and remember what needs to be remembered. Exactly 100 years ago, Sean Treacy was killed in Dublin, and this talk hopes to reclaim that flesh and blood individual who gave his life for Ireland. On Sunday, the 25th of September 1921, a large crowd gathered at Salahead for an Éireacht, which was a meeting to promote Gaelic language and culture, but which always provided an opportunity to deliver a strong political message. For example, De Valera's visit to Tipperary, well-remembered visit in 1917, was for such a purpose and was an important event in Treacy's life. A truce, of course, was in place since the 11th of July, this is 1921, remember, and the treaty wouldn't be signed until the 6th of December. So the 25th of September was something of a lull, as everyone waited for the outcome of negotiations. The local curate, Father William Keogh, he was later PP of Anacarthy, he presided and made some opening remarks by way of introduction to their guest of honour and their main speaker, a man from their parish who had suffered for their great cause, and this was P.J. Maloney, the local TD. Now, Maloney was 52 at the time, and he had formidable Republican credentials. He was a professional man, a pharmacist with his own business in Tipperary town. He was one of a handful of local men interned in Britain because of the 1916 Rising, though he had no role to play in the Rising. In the 1918 general election, which was contested in his constituency, he was returned as Member of Parliament, TD of course rather than MP, resoundingly defeating John Cullinan, the 18 years incumbent. The South Tipperary Brigade of the Volunteers, known as the Third, was founded in his home, which was burned down by the Black and Tans in November 1920. On the 1st of May 1921, his son Paddy, adjutant in the 4th Battalion, which was the Tipperary Town Battalion of the 3rd Brigade, was killed near the family home place at Garthdrum. His other two sons, Jim, but especially Con, would play important roles in the Civil War. So formidable. What Maloney said in his speech that September day in Salahead, just 5 months after the loss of his own son, was undoubtedly influenced by family history and looked bleakly to the future. And of course, he did oppose the treaty. Given his location, Salahead, the speaker had to talk about Sean Treacy. Though oddly perhaps, Father Keogh, in the parish since 1917, didn't mention Treacy, at least not in the speech as reported in the press. With reference to Treacy, following the circumstances of his death, the transformation was already underway of an actual, living, flesh and blood life into a legendary, mythic figure. What people needed him to be rather than what he was. And this is the main theme of this talk. Now, such a process was entirely understandable at a time when such heroic figures were needed. And later, when a defeated 3rd Brigade needed an icon to process, a flag to fly, a grave to gather around, a construct called Sean Treacy fitted the bill. A century on, and we should be willing and able to look at the life and circumstances of the real, the actual, flesh and blood Sean Treacy, a man whose family background was difficult, a man whose domestic circumstances were complicated, a man of grit and determination, a man who dedicated his life to a cause much bigger than his own personal interests. Put another way, if anyone listening to me thinks that the quotation that I'm about to read is an accurate reflection of Sean Treacy, well, there's a distance between us. This is a very brief quotation from Maloney's speech, and he's describing Sean Treacy. He was a quiet, unassuming, gentle, harmless, God-fearing young man who would not hurt a fly. He was deeply religious and attended faithfully to his domestic duties in his little home. Did any of Maloney's listeners, most, maybe all of whom knew Treacy, recognize this paragon? Of the 9 specifics cited, Well, Treacy was certainly a young man. He was 25 when he died. And we'll allow that he was religious. Virtually everyone at that time was, at least in an observant way. The God-fearing I'm not so sure about. After all, he, like others at the time, appears to have had no qualms about killing people. All the other qualities cited are certainly incorrect. And yet, this figure who never existed, this man who's not real, is for many people what they understand as someone called Sean Treacy. And nothing I say will change that. Even currently, this shadow, this simulacrum, is being offered as the real thing. And so as we head into the second 100 years after his death, this fantasy, Sean Treacy, will continue to occupy centre stage. In this talk to mark the exact centenary of his death, I take it as an honour to be able to speak about him. It's a responsibility I take seriously, but I'm only interested in examining the life of a real person, not a legendary figure. And if you think no further light needs to shine on that life, there's a mass card extant for Sean Treacy. It's very frequently reproduced. It has a strange spelling for the word Sean. It has the wrong date of death, the wrong age, and an incorrect military title. One might say that even the name is wrong. There's no evidence that in life Sean went by the name Alice Treacy. Here's the thing, and it's why I quoted from Maloney's speech. That speech was delivered just short of a year since Treacy was killed. And entirely understandably, the Sean Treacy he spoke about was already becoming myth, becoming legend. The young warrior sprung from the soil of Tipperary, at one with his God, his family, and his people, leading the way towards freedom. Unfortunately, for many people, understanding that life in that place and at that time continues to be framed by that simplistic and untrue construct, with no interest in the reality of that life as it was lived. A few weeks after Maloney's speech, it was the first anniversary of Treacy's death. Because this was during the truce, it allowed the 3rd Brigade to stage a show of strength and solidarity, a tradition which has continued annually, keeping the legend alive. On Dennis Lacey's orders, he was OC of the 3rd Brigade at the time, each of the 8 battalion captains that constituted the brigade was on hand. From the start, therefore, Treacy's grave was an important point of reference, a secular shrine. Strategically, it might not have been the wisest thing for the 3rd Brigade to so blatantly show its hand. Remember, while October 1921 was during the truce was not, as we now think of it, an interlude between the War of Independence and the Civil War. For those who were there, it was no more than a lull in the fighting with Crown forces, fighting that might resume any day. And there were those on the Irish side, Collins and Maloney to name but 2, for whom this was the preferred option. It had the virtue of clarity. When Treacy was buried, British intelligence took note of who was there. A year on, and this was no different. Of interest now is that we can date the absorption of the Treacy legend into the position taken by the 3rd Brigade on the Civil War. Treacy, of course, was dead before such choices were made, but it's an entirely reasonable proposition that along with most of his colleagues, he would have opposed the treaty. But what is understandable from a century ago is inexcusable today. A century ago, the reality of Treacy's life, his character and personality, who and what he was, were of little value to the cause. The image projected by a ballad was much more powerful than the reality of an actual life. For most people still, the reality of Sean Treacy is the picture painted in the best known of the ballads about him, Tipperary, So Far Away. Even for those who know the ballad well, do they ever reflect on the fact that it is just propaganda? Now, it's very effective propaganda, but it's completely at variance with the reality of Treacy's actual life. In the ballad, while he lies dying on a Dublin street, there's time and circumstance for him to communicate with a passing comrade. And that communication relates to Treacy's longing to be at home with his mother. As ballads go, this is very powerful stuff, but it has nothing to do with the reality of Treacy's life. The last place he wanted to be was at home with his mother and his aunt, Mary Ann. Commemoration and history often have little to do with each other, and the case of Sean Treacy is a good example. Commemoration in South Tipperary is about remembering the men of the 3rd Brigade. History is about exploration, which is often uncomfortable and is evidence-based. For those to whom commemoration matters, what is being paraded about like a statue at an Easter festival is the Treacy of this and other ballads, the public figure of our imaginations, who apparently had no domestic or private life, no demons of the hearth to haunt him, no difficult background, no complicated inner life. This is a wonderfully simplistic, even comfortable paradigm, a paragon who lived and died for Ireland. But that Sean Treacy is a kind of cipher, interchangeable with many other young men who fought and were killed for Ireland. Sean Treacy, Dini Lacey, Sean Treacy, take your pick. Such homogenization does them no favors, and as a pervasive process is all about us, not them. The actual Sean Treacy, whose life this is an attempt to discuss, is much, much more interesting than any such shadow. Faced with the facts of Treacy's life, it seems to me that three responses are possible. Not true, true, but shut up, and my choice. True, and all the forces that shaped her life must be looked at to understand that life. Every year, at the anniversary commemoration at the grave in Kilfeacle, a speech is delivered, which projects onto the blank canvas that is called Sean Treacy the hopes and fears of the speaker, and is marginally about the actual Sean Treacy, born 1895, died 1920. When it came to the second anniversary, the contrast between October 1921 and a year later was acute. Interestingly, the date chosen was Tuesday the 17th of October. Why that date, don't know. Treacy died on the 14th of October and was buried on the 18th. The town, Tipperary town, closed down for the day, and after Mass that morning in the parish church in Tipperary, there was a procession to Kilfeacle led by the local C.J. Kickham band. The politics of the event are of interest. The priests named and participating were all anti-treaty. By then, October 1922, the Civil War was still being fought. But the Republican side, having lost control of the towns, was waging an increasingly desperate guerrilla campaign. According to the press, there was a tacit understanding that a truce operated on that day and in that place, so that both sides on the treaty question could honour Treacy. In reality, of course, Treacy has been, as he was on that occasion, co-opted by the anti-treaty side. From the start, there was an awareness that this was being done, but as was stated in 1923, Sean Treacy's memory does not belong to any party, it belongs to the nation. The main speaker in 1922 at the anniversary was Countess Markievicz, who, like all of the Republican ladies, saw the issues of the day as questions of morality and not just political choices to be made. Incidentally, a woman who was not there that year or the previous year was Treacy's mother. She did attend in 1923. Markiewicz's fiery speech was wide-ranging, invoking Myler McGrath and Joan of Arc, and along the way having a go at the Catholic hierarchy. As ever in such circumstances, a version of Treacy was blessed as a kind of holy hero. The local TD, P.J. Maloney, also spoke, as he had the previous year. Curiously, he used almost exactly the same words that I quoted earlier when he was describing Treacy. So the creation of this construct called Sean Treacy was already well underway. On the 25th anniversary, speaking to a huge crowd at Kilfeacle, Dan Breen, unsurprisingly, was the main speaker and delivered the expected speech, emphasizing Treacy's single-mindedness and strength of purpose, about which he was absolutely correct, not, of course, suggesting where these qualities came from. I have no doubt that they came from Treacy's father. One wonders what the assembled crowd made of Breen's claim that while he was lying in the Mater, wounded from the Fernside episode, that Treacy, who by now was dead, appeared to him. The last time I saw him was on a Tuesday in the Mater Hospital, and the next time was when he stood by my bedside on the Thursday evening and told me he was killed. Yes, he told me he was dead. He also told me he would come again. I'm sure you can see the religious motifs running through this, and it was all part of a construct, what one account of this 25th anniversary called Tipperary's staunchest patriot. That same year, incidentally, Breen wrote what I think was his only standalone piece on Treacy, an article in an Irish Army periodical, part of a series called Irish Leaders of Our Time. Apart from errors on detail, like when Dennis Treacy died, that's Sean's father, the article is at one with the proprietorial interest that Breen always took in Treacy. He was never keen on others writing or talking about him. He was the Treacy expert, the keeper of the flame. No sign of Seamus Robinson in Kilfeacle in 1945, and after all, he was number 1 to Treacy's number 2 in the brigade. He should have been there, but by then, Breen dominated the Tipperary space. The highlight of this 25th anniversary was Desmond Ryan's biography, which was published by Anvil Books, an imprint of the Kerryman, which specialised in works about the War of Independence, and was published with the financial and other support from the 3rd Tipperary Brigade Old IRA Memorial Committee. Research was done with difficulty due to travel restrictions because of the emergency. It's a book I have a sentimental attachment to. For family reasons, it's a book I grew up with. We did not have a copy of Breen's book, but I avidly consumed the Treacy biography. In researching the book, not everyone was helpful. Specifically, for whatever reason, Dan Breen kept his distance from the project and was decidedly sniffy about the published book. An advantage of the book is that many of those who took part in the events 1916 to 20 were still around, so what they might choose to tell. Paradoxically, that's also the book's disadvantage, what they might choose not to tell. The book has lots of interesting information, photographs, but it's subsumed in a kind of gung-ho Republican narrative and doesn't have any real meaningful analysis. Put another way, the book was a product of its time, and it's no worse because of that. It is what it is. But when a new biography by a Clonmel writer was published in 2007, it was as if the intervening 62 years just fell away. So seamlessly did the new fit into the old, casting no new light on the subject. It was an opportunity wasted. On the 50th anniversary in 1970, both the President, De Valera, and the Taoiseach, Jack Lynch, were present, together with all the public representatives that one might wish. As always, who spoke and what was said reflected more about current concerns than the reality of 1916 to 20. The spirit of poor Dennis Treacy, Sean's father, might have stirred uneasily at the fact that yet again this was an Alice as much as a Treacy event. The key speaker was Father Jim Alice, a first cousin of Sean Treacy, and he was followed by a former member of a Cork brigade. Clearly the organisers were mindful of wider events in 1970. By 1995 and the 75th anniversary, that was also, of course, the centenary of Treacy's birth. And so proceedings at Kilfeacle were more special than usual, reinforcing the point that by now Treacy's life had become a blank page on which those who purported to honour him wrote their own inscriptions. There were, as usual, 2 events. One organised by the 3rd Tipperary Brigade Old IRA, and their speaker was Jerry Collins, who at that time was an MEP. And the other event was organised by the South Tipperary Republican Commemoration Committee, and its key speaker from the north of Ireland was Mitchell McLaughlin. The 2 men might just as well have been at any other grave. What they said had nothing to do with Treacy, who was hardly mentioned, and everything to do with current political preoccupations in Northern Ireland. At their worst, and that was certainly the case here, such speeches tell you nothing about the time and place being commemorated, and everything about those doing the commemorating. So, to repeat myself, this was another example of Treacy being what people wanted and needed him to be, and had nothing to do with a real person. And one can only await with eager anticipation what will be said by the graveside to mark the centenary. But I'm guessing it won't have a lot to do with the man buried there. If I might use a metaphor, the annual commemoration has invariably been a mirror reflecting ourselves and not a window through which to glimpse the past. You'll have gathered by now that this talk is not a summary of Treacy's career, his greatest hits, so to speak, pun intended, in an hour that would do him no service and do you no good. His public life, however, can be summarised in 9 key episodes: Dundalk Jail, Salahead Beg, Knocklong, Ashtown, Hollyford, Drangan, Ula, Fernside, Talbot Street. The actual casualty list for these 9 events is not that remarkable. You can count it different ways, but maybe it's around 20 people dead, including at the end Treacy himself. It's the business of the historian to understand who and what Treacy was, the influences that came to bear on him, the choices he made. That's the subject of this talk, not the shadowy figure of the ballads, not the local legend, and certainly not the Sean Treacy of numerous platform speeches. Not even God knows that Sean Treacy, because he's not real. Looking back on his brief life, one can see some kind of pattern. Treacy's life can be summed up in 9 key themes to match the 9 episodes I mentioned. The dysfunctional family background, not uncommon with such men. His cultural baptism, with Eamon O'Dea pouring the holy water and Father Matt Ryan, so to speak, saying the prayers. The transformative experience of Easter 1916. His vital education, not in Hollyford National School or in the Tipperary Old Mon, Christian Brothers in Tipperary, but in Dundalk Jail. His role in the 3rd Brigade, his consecration to the policy of violence, his life on the run, his death, and his iconic transfiguration. To understand Sean Treacy, it is self-evidently necessary to look to the circumstances that produced and shaped him, nature and nurture. In any case, the flesh and blood John, who eventually becomes Sean, is infinitely more interesting than the shadowy figure of legend and imagination. Point I repeat and repeat. 10 years ago, Tipperary Historical Journal published an article on Treacy's family background, specifically the story of his Treacy grandmother and the inheritance war that divided her sons, a story of terrible crimes over land. Imagine John B. Keane crossed with Quentin Tarantino, and you might manage a glimpse of the passion and turmoil in Treacy's background. It's the story of a snug leasehold farm of 23 acres that Sean Treacy's father, Dennis, was prepared to do anything, literally anything, to get hold of and keep. And after all that, having sacrificed so much for a farm, to pass it on, hopefully, to a son. The irony is that the farm ended up in the hands of another family. When in 1945, Desmond Ryan published his biography of Sean Treacy, what he had to say about his subject's Treacy background was covered in a sentence. Sean Treacy's father was remembered among his neighbours as a man of strong personality, and it was said that Sean resembled him in many ways. Generations of readers have taken this sentence with its 2 statements at face value. But as this discussion reveals, the first statement about Dennis, a man of strong personality, well, that's very ambiguous. The second statement about his son is very problematic. Sean resembled him in many ways. That's not something I am denying. There's no evidence in Desmond Ryan's research material that he knew about Treacy's family history. But that doesn't mean that in talking to people that he didn't hear something, none of which background could have been used in a book published in 1945. Sean Treacy's grandmother, Mary Treacy, had 2 sons and 3 daughters that survived to adulthood. One might have expected that Thomas, who was 10 years older than Dennis, and Dennis was Sean's father, one might have expected that Thomas, 10 years older, would have inherited the farm. But their mother's will of 1865 created a toxic situation that set brother against brother. Not for ownership of the farm, which is part of the estate of the Erasmus Smith Schools, but for the leasehold interest. As happens when disputes lethally divide a family, the sisters also chose sides. In what was a long and convoluted story, which is detailed elsewhere, there was a lot of litigation. In the words of one legal gentleman in 1877, the whole history of the Treacys went to show that they were capable of any act, no matter how bold or fraudulent. It was not just the brothers who were prepared to do anything for land, but the sisters were no more scrupulous to the same end. Some of the highlights in an extraordinary story are Dennis Treacy shooting at his brother's wife and members of her family. Now, there is a contemporary source, a chap called McGrath kept a diary, and he noted, 3rd of August 1873, Dennis, he doesn't give the surname, but it's Dennis Treacy, fired a gun through the kitchen window of his brother's house at Mr. and Mrs. Ned Carew. No damage done. Dennis Treacy received 2 years hard labour for assaulting his pregnant sister-in-law, Tom's wife. The baby, another John. John was a Treacy family name. The baby didn't long survive birth. Again, the local McGrath diary, unsurprisingly, paid note to this. Dennis Treacy of Salahead was sentenced to 2 years imprisonment with hard labour for beating Mrs. Thomas Treacy. When he was in jail, one of his sisters on his side of the family split was murdered, probably by brother Thomas. And again from the McGrath diary, Mrs. Michael Hayes, that's Julia Treacy, of Milltown, was shot dead in her bed at 1:30 p.m. And so on. Assaults and litigation, so that the family was notorious. In the end, the struggle for the Salahead farm was won by Dennis, and the older brother Thomas was reduced to the status of labourer in Tipperary town. It is not unreasonable to argue that Sean Treacy's inheritance from his father was not really that much fought over farm, but his resolute, fixed determination once set on a course to pursue it. In his father's case, that was devoted to entirely selfish ends, possession of a farm, but in his son's, it was concentrated towards an absolutely selfless end, what he saw as the interest of his country. Anyway, with the great family saga finally concluded, and Dennis Treacy finally in control of the farm, what was the point of it all if there was no one to hand it on to? Before there could be an heir, there needed to be a wife. Easier said than done, given the stink of sulphur that attached to Dennis Treacy. And not to beat about the bush, an examination of the evidence allows no other conclusion than that he was a thug. On the plus side, he had a fine farm of land, and in the context of the time, he was an old man. You can imagine a conversation with a prospective bride. Deanie Treacy over there in Salahead has a fine farm and at Lacehold. Yes, but people say such terrible things about him. It's great land, so I'm told. I heard he was in jail. That was a long time ago. And anyhow, it's a fine farm, and there are no other traces hanging off him. And he's not a young man. Oh, I don't know. Well, you're not getting any younger, so think about it. On the 5th of February 1894, Dennis Treacy married Bridget Alice of Hollyford, always, as she was entitled to be, reticent about her age. He was in his early 60s, and given his history, hardly a catch. She was nearly 40, and not an obvious prospect for motherhood. She was baptized the 8th of July, 1855. No doubt a match was made. Whatever this was, it was no dewy-eyed romance, but a tough business proposition, and as ever, all about land. Amusingly, the civil marriage registration record gives his age as 45 and hers as 30. Don't know why they bothered, because if they had just written full age, it would have done. Now, at this point, I should perhaps explain I'm talking about family. Now, I'm called Dennis after my grandfather, Dennis Stapleton, from Piper Hill in Hollyford. His aunt, Catherine Stapleton, married James Alice, and their daughter was the Bridget about whom I speak. My grandfather, therefore, was a first cousin of Bridget Alice. When my grandfather was born, one of his sponsors at his baptism was James Alice, Bridget's father, and James was born around 1820. And what intrigues me particularly is there's a photograph of my grandfather holding me in his arms. He died a few months after I was born. I'm assured not cause and effect. So across exactly 2 centuries, from 1820 to 2020, 3 people are connected with just 2 points of contact. James Alice, Bridget's father, holding Dennis Stapleton when he was a baby, and at the end of his long life, my grandfather holding me at the beginning of mine. Now, Dennis Treacy died on the 18th of March, 1899, and the registration of his death was from bronchial pneumonia, and it declared he was 67. There appears to have been no rush to register the death, but of course he was now surplus to requirement. Given all that he had done to get his farm, it's not unreasonable to think that the happiest, the best day of his life was when his son John was born on the 14th of February, 1895, almost exactly a year after the wedding, and the fact that he survived, he didn't appear sickly, and given the rate of infant mortality and the ages of the parents, another child didn't seem a likely prospect. It's in keeping with the story, as I earlier outlined, about family division, that there was no Treacy representation among the sponsors at his baptism. I mean, usually it's one from each side. In this instance, the sponsors were Bridget's siblings, Michael and Kate Alice. Dennis Treacy died on the 19th of March, 1899, so that John was just 4, and like many Republican leaders, he grew up without a father. which, however, did not mean that he grew up without male role models and mentors. So far, the Treacy story is the story of a farm, and given all that Dennis Treacy had done to get the farm, it was deeply ironic that by the 1901 census, what was Treacy had very definitely become Alice. In situ was Bridget, always much more Alice than Treacy, her younger brother Michael, and her younger sister Nora. And there was a young farm servant, but there was no actual Treacy, no 6-year-old John. So where was he, and why was he not at home with his mother? Well, again in 1901, he was at the Alice home place in Lacknacrina with another member of the family, James, who was then 34 and unmarried, and his 2 sisters, including Mary Ann, who comes into the story later. So John seems to have remained in Hollyford, and he certainly entered Hollyford National School in November 1900. Now, James married in 1905. That meant his nephew John was 10, and I suppose there was no reason why his new wife would have the encumbrance of a 10-year-old child. So maybe at this point they returned to Solihull. In truth, it remains unclear to me why he was away from Solihull in the first place. Amusingly, again, this is common, in 1901 census, Bridget Alice is 45. 10 years later, she's 48. In 1911, she was actually 56, but that's quite common in those census returns. By 1911, therefore, John Treacy is 16, and he's back in Solihull Beg, and with him were his mother, and her sister had returned from Hollyford to Solihull, Mary Ann, and there was also a farm servant. Now, 2 years earlier, in 1909, John Treacy sat the junior grade intermediate examination at the Christian Brothers, the Old Mon in the Tipperary Hills, its location beside a famine graveyard perhaps not being unnoticed, and later he passed to the middle grade. That he had some second-level education would set him apart at a time when virtually no one had more than primary education. Now, whose idea it was to allow this advantage is not known, at least I don't know it, but it's hard to see that either his mother or his aunt were behind it. Perhaps his uncle Michael, Alice, encouraged the project. With his father dead, the son can have had little or no memory of him, and I incline to think probably heard little about him. The son certainly had little or no contact with his father's immediate family. The influence brought to bear was overwhelmingly Alice rather than Treacy. Given his difficult relationship with some of that family, his mother certainly, especially his mother's sister Mary Ann, who was a fixture in the household. Now, she never married and died in 1937 at the age of 75. She was something of a stock character, first of all looking after her mother, who died in 1895, and then for years with her widowed sister Bridget. Certainly, Dan Breen unloaded himself about her in his Bureau of Military History evidence. Treacy's father had died, this is Dan Breen. Treacy's father had died when he was very young, and he, with his mother, lived with an aunt about whom I could say nothing complimentary. She was a bossy, domineering type. She dominated Sean's mother entirely and tried also to compel Sean to live in the grooves she had marked out for him. To my knowledge, she made life a complete hell for him by frustrating all his natural inclinations. She had no national sentiments and was intolerant of any such matters when Sean might allow his interest in them to become known in the house. Her effort was to make him work on the small farm that they had and which could scarcely make a living for them. I'm not clear why that is. It was a good farm, 24, 23 acres. She would allow him no relaxation whatever, nor any thought outside the sheer necessities of life. Immediately following 1916, she made strenuous objections to be seen keeping company with me, that is Dan Breen, and in later years she was always referring to me as Breen the murderer, and so on it goes. Now, enough is known about how rural Ireland worked a century ago to posit the notion that part of Mary Ann's problem with Breen was social, unless we want to blind ourselves to the reality of relations between farmers and labourers. Breen's opinion is of interest, but it's coming from someone who clearly didn't like the woman or get on with her. But it was easier for Breen to attack the aunt than to level any criticism at Treacy's mother. We could, I think, should reread the piece from Breen, but share out the disapproval between the two sisters. We all know that on the Pearse model, the mothers of dead patriots are inviolate. A factor that came into play when years later the issue arose about getting Mrs. Treacy, Sean's mother, a pension because of her son's sacrifice for Ireland. Anyway, Breen didn't always have his information correct. After this onslaught, he went on to say that I mention this in passing to show how great was Sean Treacy's intellect, because though he had not a scrap of national sentiment on either side of the family, the Treacys and the Alices, he himself had done his own reading and studying and made up his own mind on these matters. Now, maybe that's true on the Treacy side. As we've seen, his immediate Treacy family was land hungry to an abnormal degree, even for 19th century rural Ireland. But it's not true with respect to the Alice family. On Tuesday, the 6th of October, 1914, 19-year-old John Treacy stood with his mother in Toome churchyard as his cousin William Alice of Gurthnacoola was buried. Young Treacy cannot but have been impressed and moved by the display provided by members of the Volunteers and the AOH for a man who had been out in '67, a man who had campaigned for Donovan Rossa and Kickham, a man who had been in the square at Mitchelstown in '87 when the police fired into the crowd. In fact, on the coffin was placed a remnant of the flag that he had carried on that day. So that was October 1914. Now for Treacy, 1914 is certainly when he found a worthy object on which to fasten the single-mindedness, the focus, the ruthlessness inherited from his father. Even Desmond Ryan, in his biography, as circumscribed as he was by time and place, couldn't paint his hero as other than a hard man. There is therefore evidence from both nature and nurture to explain how this man had some of the qualities to take on an empire. However, he lacked a necessary quality that allowed for survival: caution. All too evident in October 1920. It was around this same time, 1914, that Jim Kilmartin, from the same parish, remembered first meeting Treacy, and for someone not out of his teens, it was instructive that the context of the encounter was Treacy in a leadership role. There's no doubt, in more modern terms, that Treacy was an alpha male, the kind of person who in a group others automatically look to for leadership. He also read, not widely, but deeply in selected texts, and appeared to think about what he read, not that common. Later, when Ernie O'Malley met and worked with Treacy, he noted his dry humour, and praise indeed coming from O'Malley. He remembered Treacy dealing with his men quietly and confessed, "I envied him his ease, yet he never allowed slackness to pass by." Sean Treacy certainly understood that the RIC was the front line of defence for the empire. And looking at a member of that force was like looking into a mirror. That, I think, is what made fighting the RIC so odd. For any one of them, and for anyone on the other side, change a few factors: family history here, economic imperative there, and Paddy Ryan, your Tipperary everyman, could be either RIC or IRA. In a sense, John Treacy was born at the right time, 1895, which meant that he came to manhood during the lean years when the big story was all about Home Rule and the machinations of the Irish Parliamentary Party. No chance for anything heroic. It was all talk and talk and talk and more talk. But in 1914, Treacy was exactly the right age to be energised by the wonderful, exciting new organisation, the Irish Volunteers. And it's hard to think that he was not in Tipperary town on Sunday, the 10th of May, 1914, when a branch was inaugurated by Sean McDermott, there also in his capacity as IRB organiser. The Volunteers, however, soon fell flat once the Great War began, and a rump was left after almost all of the membership followed Redmond's naive strategy of thinking that the British cared enough about Ireland to recognise its aspirations in gratitude for fighting against the Germans. Empires are not built on gratitude. But before that fateful year, other forces were at work directing John Treacy's attention to the most fundamental issue of the time: the nature of Irish identity. And in that journey, he had two crucial mentors, Father Matt Ryan and Eamon O'Dear, for each of whom and through whom, for Treacy, the key was the Irish language. One can easily imagine the Alice ladies, his mother and aunt, thinking, was there anything more useless? And of course, it was at this point, like for so many others, that John became Sean, representing for him, as for so many others, a kind of cultural baptism, a regeneration. And I can't help wondering how long it was, if ever, before the Alice ladies called him Sean. Now, this is not a talk about Eamon O'Dear, but his life is an object lesson about the difference between popular perception, which can be hugely misleading, and history, which is in the business of understanding the past through evidence. Eamon O'Dear died in June 1963, very much not a central part of the story of cultural and national revival in the county earlier that century. It was not until what was written and said since 2016 that this was changed. Similarly with respect to Seamus Robinson, and it was O'Dear who was responsible for bringing Robinson to Tipperary, and both, like with Soviet propaganda, removed from the photographs, so to speak, of Republican activism during those years. As I said, it's a reminder that what people choose to remember and what actually happened can be very different. As a mentor, O'Dear was exciting. He was part of the language movement, of the IRB, of Sinn Féin, and in touch with the wider world. Treacy attended Irish language classes held on the top floor of St. Anne's Secondary School in Tipperary town. And apart from learning Irish, conversations to and from the classes must have been about more than matches, weather, and crops. The importance of the language movement cannot be overstated. For Treacy, as for so many others, it was their way of finding a new identity. At its simplest, the language movement affirmed Irish difference within the United Kingdom, while the volunteer movement gave that difference muscle. Easter week 1916 for Treacy, as for so many others down the country, was a mixture of excitement and confusion, followed by disappointment. I've described elsewhere his almost frantic efforts to become part of the rebirth. As I said, excitement and confusion, as Treacy cycled here and there, to Balloch, to Galbally, and as far as Mitchelstown in the hope of news and action. But it was not to be. And afterwards, reorganisation of the movement, when Treacy came into his own as an organiser and leader. I've elsewhere described Treacy's exertions, drilling his men, and it cannot have been an easy thing to sustain enthusiasm for a movement purporting to be an army which had virtually no weapons. And it cannot have been easy for someone with no domestic support and no familial backing. And it is in this relentless pushing against the odds that his father in him can most clearly be seen. A pivotal moment in his career was in August 1917, when, as I mentioned at the beginning, De Valera came to Tipperary for an eridict, and that resulted in Treacy's arrest for parading about and providing a military-style guard of honour. In fact, the police were out to get him for other things. He spent several months in jail in 2 different lots. I don't doubt the most significant 6 months of his life. Not making him what he was, that was down to nature and nurture, but hardening the pattern already being set. Dundalk Jail was his university, where, among others, he met Ernest Blythe, Michael Brennan, Oscar Traynor, Dick McKee, Terence McSweeney, Michael Collivat, and Diarmuid Lynch. As Ernest Blythe remembered, it was, his word, fun, by which he means it was very collegial. The men were together. Blythe shared a cell with Treacy, Brennan, and Seamus O'Neill, who was also a 3rd Brigade man. While in Dundalk, towards the end of May 1918, in a letter to his uncle Michael Ellis, Treacy declared his credo. Now, I'd like you and all concerned to know once and forever that I've put Ireland over all long ago, and that I'll not allow my own interests or the interests of anybody else to prevent me helping her cause all in my power. You may say this is nonsense, but it's the fact. When I'm released, I shall at once devote all my energies in the furtherance of that cause in the best way I can. Hence the title of this talk, A Life for Ireland. Now, this extract is quoted in Ryan's biography. Understandably, he does not quote Treacy's statement that make clear his alienation from family and home. The Alice sisters, his mother and aunt. Nothing, I think, makes this alienation, even bitterness, more clear than what happened when, like thousands of other young people, Treacy came down with flu. And in that epidemic, young people were the most at risk. Once stricken, he needed bed, rest, and care. So where did he look for it? From his mother and aunt? No. Such care as was needed was provided by Dan Breen's mother. His rejection of whatever hopes and plans the Alice sisters had for him cannot have been easy for them, who simply wanted him to stay at home and work his farm. That pronoun his, of course, is problematic. Even though Sean Treacy became 21 in 1916, the farm was still in his mother's name. Then, just weeks after the Salahead Beg ambush in April 1919, under land purchase legislation, ownership of the farm passed, not to a Treacy, but to his mother, who, as I said, was very much an Alice. This process would have been set in motion before the ambush. In a letter to Sean Fitzpatrick, Seamus Robinson had a cryptic remark relating to a time shortly before Treacy was killed, explaining that Treacy was in Dublin for personal reasons, one of which, and I quote, was for the fixing up of the legal side of his patrimony, something that he would have had to do in light of a forthcoming marriage, regarding which the idea of Sean and his new wife, May Quigley, moving in with Bridget and Mary Ann hardly bears thinking. His relationship with Quigley stretched back to at least 1917, and one has to wonder about the strain on her during these years. She actually married in 1925. She married a Cork man, and she died in 1971. If his mother and aunt were a pair of sisters with whom he could not cope, there was another pair of sisters to whom he turned. Alice and Kate Ryan, who had a shop in Church Street in Tipperary town. It's now the DSP office in Church Street. And they were a total contrast to the Alice sisters. They were involved in the political and cultural movements of the day, especially Cumann na mBan. And it was entirely apposite that there he met their niece, whom he hoped to marry, May Quigley. Incidentally, that shop in Church Street was the setting for one of the few glimpses we have of Treacy as seen by a sympathetic outsider. That encounter with Elizabeth Bloxham, a woman with similar politics to his own, but whose background was very different, I cited in the 3rd Brigade book, but because it perfectly illustrates one of the great weaknesses of the nationalist Republican mindset, shared by Treacy, of course, a complete inability to understand, indeed to take seriously, the unionist mentality. To repeat, the importance of his prison experience cannot be overemphasized. Prior to this experience, it was membership of the IRB that gave a sense of being part of something that was more than just organizational, but that was a bond that reached into the past and connected the dead with the living, a connection that was less relevant by 1919. Apart from its impact on Treacy's state of mind and way of looking at the world, this prison experience set him apart from most of his peers in Tipperary. When free between these two lots of incarceration, from November 1917 through to February 1918, Treacy threw himself into the work of company and battalion organisation in what was the 3rd Brigade's core area of Midwest Tipperary. From what glimpses we have from friend and foe of Treacy at work, building, encouraging, organising, indicates excellent leadership skills. Treacy at his best. All the more unfortunate, therefore, that for much of the actual War of Independence, Treacy was not in Tipperary. When it came time to pull together the organisational bits and pieces into a brigade structure, had there been no Seamus Robinson, whom one can think of as a kind of foreign agent injected into the South Tipperary body politic, there would have been no question but Treacy would have become OC. It was, I think, a mistake that he did not. This is something I've discussed in the 3rd Brigade and noted the danger of accepting Dan Breen's version of events. In the end, it may have been that as a number 2 rather than a number 1 in the brigade, he would have had more freedom, but that doesn't get round an essential paradox at the heart of the Volunteers IRA. A paradox encapsulated in the progression from volunteer with a small v to a Republican army. Treacy was intelligent enough to understand that the essence of an army is hierarchy and discipline. Otherwise, your company or battalion or brigade has more in common with the banditti or localized, partially armed groups of earlier centuries, little better than white boys or defenders. Richard Mulcahy understood this rather more than Michael Collins did, hence the tensions between Robinson especially and Mulcahy, between the centre and the periphery. Now, I once wrote that the Salahead Beg ambush was a reaction not to tyranny, but to boredom. As I mentioned, it was entirely unreasonable to think that young men and some young women would be indefinitely contented to march about, an army without weapons and without purpose, especially when to hand were men with weapons, attacking whom gave purpose, and the RIC was ready-made as an enemy. Now, it's possible to hold two views about the RIC at the same time. Firstly, the local, the personal, the human. Now, with the roots industry, many of us have found peelers in our background. Earlier, I mentioned my grandfather, Dennis Stapleton. Well, his sister married a peeler, and off they went to Liverpool. Secondly, there is the historic and the strategic. As always with British colonial policy, recruit the natives to control the natives, but don't allow them into the upper ranks. Look, for example, to Hong Kong, historically, where the policy was all the more obvious. Non-white lower, white upper. I've no doubt that Treacy was intelligent enough to understand this. However, I have posited that on the 21st of January 1919, it was about explosives and weapons, not about killing policemen. But as I argue, a willingness to shoot is not the same as an intention to kill. The evidence points towards Treacy killing MacDonald, and the evidence indicates that being his father's son, he had no hesitation about shooting when he deemed circumstances warranted it. And if you need some proof about the importance of evidence-based history, and maybe recently you saw there was 2 programs fronted by Michael Portillo you saw the program makers went to the trouble of going to the site of the ambush. And in their narration, they only mentioned Dan Breen, which of course would have pleased Breen inordinately. But it was all like talking about the 1950 Munster final and forgetting to mention Christy Ring. So that very recent illustration shows the value to Breen's reputation of his memoir being written so soon after these events and the evidence that it still exerts. The problem in this Trumpian age, which is what we're in, is that what I know and what you think are given an equivalence, but of course they haven't an equivalence because only one of those two is evidence-based. Now, Treacy's life after Salahid Beg was a life on the run. Now, this part of his story is punctuated by Knock Long, life before and after that melodrama, which is usually presented as an exercise in daring do, and very dramatic it was. At some point, the characterization of the Big Four was created, and it provides a kind of smokescreen behind which people do not look. But examine the situation dispassionately, and it calls into question the judgment of the brigade leadership. Why was Sean Hogan, an ill-disciplined miner, with them? I have no idea what the answer is. It was not the case that his behaviour was a surprise. McDavern has described Treacy's pissed-off reaction to Hogan's hormonal exuberance. This was the first time that I had seen Sean really vexed. This question is separate from the contribution of Knock Long to the spread of the message that the volunteers were about more than posturing. A lot of people had to die to make that point. By 1920, Dublin is largely Treacy's stage, and here's a question. Was that because he had to, or because he wanted to? The answer cannot be that Dublin was safer than the countryside. After all, Dublin killed him. We have just occasional glimpses of him. Paddy Colgan was from Kildare, and his region was a conduit for messages back and forth between GHQ and the south. So Colgan was used to dispatches being delivered. He explained that one day, after the Knock Long rescue, I noticed a fellow dismounting from a bicycle outside my office. Suspecting he was a dispatch carrier, I approached him to inquire who he wished to see. He wanted to see me. I asked him, whom shall I say wanted to see him? He replied he was a friend of mine. I then identified myself. He in turn took a notebook from his pocket, opened it, and showed a page with my name written. He asked me if I recognized the writing. I told him it was written by Mick Collins. He then identified himself as Sean Treacy, a friend of Seamus Robinson. Now, Treacy had news that the Knock Long men were staying near Burr, but needed to be moved. With the help of Donal O'Buchala of Maynooth, now Buchala was later Dev's Governor-General, and that's how he's remembered, they were able to put the men up for a week or so until arrangements could be made to get them to Dublin. Robinson went on to make his own arrangements, which doesn't show exact leadership solidarity. Colgan's account continues. Certain death awaited them if captured. Yet a more cheery lot I've never met. It would not have been an easy matter to capture them. They were armed to the teeth with revolvers and grenades. With great fun during their stay, Sean Treacy, while as full of fun as anyone else, spent a lot of his time reading small arms manuals. They finally moved into Dublin to Phil Shanahan's at Corporation Street. They left their spare revolvers, ammunition and grenades in my charge. Now the fugitives, having moved to Dublin, left many of their weapons behind, and that gave Colgan the job of conveying them to Phil Shanahan's. And he arrived first time to find that the tip men had decamped to Clontarf Baths, and on another occasion, they, or at least Dan Breen, turned up at the Abbey Theatre. Colgan could only sum up the fugitives as a set of loonies who knew no fear. So it all seems fun and games in Dublin. But the reality was much, much darker. When the story is told of the many months after Knock Long, it very much features safe houses, without attention being drawn to the maths of the situation. There were far more nights a safe house was needed than there were safe houses available. And with safe houses, maths again comes into play. Every time such a house was used, it was less safe. The reality is that on many nights, there was no safe house. It has to be understood that Treacy's life in Dublin was one of hardship and danger. Annie Farrington, who helped run the Crown Hotel in O'Connell Street in Dublin, it's beside the Gresham, so there's nothing like hiding in plain sight. She described meeting men like Treacy, and she remembered on one occasion about 6 or 7 of them came, and they were in a dreadful condition. They had been sleeping inside the walls surrounding some church for several nights, and had a few days' growth of beard. Dan Breen, begged me to give them some sort of a shakedown. So apart from this wretched physical existence, life day to day must have been tedious, and hence the bursts of excitement such as the attack on Lord French at Ashtown must have been welcomed, if nothing else, to relieve the tedium. And this is from Harry Boland's sister. I should have mentioned Harry opened a tailoring and outfitting business about October 1917 in Mid-Labby Street, and it became an important centre for dispatches from all places, especially from the south. Mick Collins asked to see me. I went to his office in Mary Street. He said there were some very important men from Tipperary, and he mentioned Sean Treacy's name, coming up to Dublin, and that he was going to send some of them out to me. He also asked me whether I knew of any other safe houses where the people were not talkative, and where these men could stay under assumed names. Incidentally, the name Sean Treacy had taken was, well, what could it be but Ryan? I sent Joe O'Reilly to Miss Eva Doherty, a quiet girl that I knew in Common, to get some safe houses, and she recommended to him Malone's house in Grantham Street and the Delaney's in Heytesbury Street. That evening, Seamus Robinson and Sean Treacy arrived at our house. I'll never forget my feelings when I saw the condition they were in. The soles were gone from their boots, and they were footsore, weary, wet through, and hungry. We gave them a hot meal in the kitchen. They stayed with us a couple of nights and then moved on somewhere else. Sean Treacy, Seamus Robinson, and their two companions came often to stay with us afterwards, bringing with them various volunteers. So life during that period was extraordinarily difficult. Even as simple as money, where was that going to come from to keep them going? Now, the Fernside episode, which brings us to October 1920, was all about safe houses and the danger attached to them. On Monday, the 11th of October 1920, thinking it was best to avoid one safe house, Treacy and Breen opted for another nearby, that of a lecturer in the Teacher Training College. In fact, shortly after, Fernside was raided. So also was the other house, Fleming's at 140 Drumcondra Road. Treacy and Breen let themselves into Fernside, going from one house to the other. Very early on Tuesday morning, the house was raided. Given that the advantage was entirely with the British, it was an extraordinary feat that Treacy and Breen got away. Now, if there's ever a movie of Treacy's life, then Fernside will dominate the trailer. There's a story from one of the soldiers purporting to be at the scene, and I quote, he said he saw one of them clinging with one hand to a rafter of the roof of the conservatory while he was firing his gun with the other. So this is serious Tom Cruise territory. So you see what I mean by that being the trailer. Their escape was extraordinary. Now, leading the raiding party was a brother of Lieutenant Colonel Gerald Smythe Smith in Ireland in a policing capacity, and a man who made the infamous declaration at Listowel RIC barracks encouraging official terror. Before long, he was dispatched by an IRA hit squad, sometimes but wrongly ascribed to Dan Breen. And it was said then that his younger brother came to Ireland from Egypt to avenge his dead brother. So Major Smythe and a Captain White were killed, as was the unfortunate owner of the house at Fernside. Treacy and Breen separated, having got out of the house, and managed to get away. Treacy made his way to Finglas, and he got refuge at the home of a Holyford man, Phil Ryan. Now, Ryan was a long time in Dublin, but he was from Holyford. And he happened to be married to an aunt of Joe Lawless. And Lawless, I suppose, is mainly remembered now as the photographer who managed to sneak his camera into an internment camp in 1921. 3 years later, when Phil Ryan had an opportunity to speak publicly about this encounter, the strands of the story can be isolated. You have Treacy's physical condition, which was not good, obviously, his excited emotional state, and in spite of everything, his adherence to expected values. From his wounds being dressed, to his determination not to stay put, to his kneeling by his bed before his few hours of sleep, and again with the detail that he placed his rosary beads under his pillow. All details that you might expect to find. Treacy insisted on leaving. He cited dangers to his hosts, but I take it that he was just so wound up that he couldn't stay still and he wanted to be gone. So that was Monday night, Tuesday morning. Later on that Tuesday, according to Joe Lawless, who had collected the injured Breen from where he had ended up in Botanic Avenue and brought him to a building near the Mater, Treacy showed up at the building having cycled from Finglas on Tuesday morning. And his description, Sean Treacy, indeed, as full of life and mocking humour as ever, though garbed in somewhat burlesque fashion, with a coat several sizes too large for him, the sleeves of which were rolled up at the cuff. Now, the explanation for the odd wardrobe is that they were the clothes of Phil Ryan, who was apparently a pretty large man. Again, the serious point is, of course, dressed like that could not but have attracted official attention at him. Not a sensible thing to have done. So that night, Tuesday the 12th of October, Treacy went back to Finglas, and on Wednesday the 13th of October, early morning, he was back in town by bicycle, anxious for news about Breen. Obviously, it would have been more sensible to keep a low profile. There was some idea of attacking the funeral cortege of the two men killed at Fernside, the two British officers, one of whom the body was being brought back to England, the other was being brought to Northern Ireland. That attack never came off, but one gets the impression that if it did, Treacy wanted to be in on it. He wasn't in any condition to be there. Wednesday evening, Treacy spent with Paddy Daly, members of Collins' so-called squad. Treacy would have known these men. He was with Daly, for example, in the attack on Lord French at Ashtown at the end of 1919. Wednesday night, he spent at Bob Holland's house at Inchicore, 6 Silverdale Terrace. This is out beyond Houston railway station. Mrs. Holland, according to Desmond Ryan, was horrified at Treacy's condition. He was still suffering from the effects of the Fernside fight. He was footsore from his wanderings. Mrs. Holland insisted on bathing his feet and providing a change of clothing. Paddy Daly described Treacy's feet as badly cut and inflamed. Daly also described him as a very sick man. Everybody who met him wanted him to stay put and keep his head down. Little doubt that, again, looking back from today, that Treacy was suffering from what today would, I suppose, be recognised as PTSD. Maybe we think that men 100 years ago had a different psychology to people today in comparable circumstances. I don't think so. Daly then left to meet some colleagues at the Republican Outfitters, so this is where they come into the story at 94 Talbot Street. You have to wonder about the wisdom of a premises with that name as a clandestine meeting place. Never got that, really. It's now the morning of Thursday, the 14th of October, and Treacy's restless nature meant that he had to be more central to whatever was happening in town, where there was intense police and military activity. The sensible thing would have been for him to stay put, lie low. According to Daly, he'd hardly arrived by bike at Talbot Street when Treacy followed him into the shop. He and people like Father Clancy, who owned the shop, didn't want to hang about too long and tried to get Treacy to leave with them, but he wanted to wait to meet some others. Did Treacy have some kind of death wish? His actions since Fernside were of no value to him or to the cause. As discussed, there was intense police and military activity. The Republican Outfitters, not exactly a secret location, and unless the authorities were stupid, of course they kept an eye on it. Treacy left at that time, it's the morning of Thursday, and it's as if he wanted to expose himself to the enemy as much as possible. He refused to go with Daly and his colleagues, and this accounts for his movements since leaving Inchicore. It must have been that after this he travelled to Hughes's Hotel in Lower Gardiner Street, and there we have the evidence of Tom Doyle. He had stayed in the hotel on the Wednesday night, but he met Treacy there on the Thursday morning. Treacy also there, he met D.P. Walsh, who was from Feathered, and Walsh had an important organisational procurement role with the volunteers at a national level. Treacy meeting Walsh was obviously about getting equipment for the 3rd Brigade. So he was certainly busy. When people decades later came to recall these events, it would have been odd had the chronology not been contradictory, if you try and piece it together. Doyle, for example, gives the impression, perhaps he was under the impression, that Treacy stayed at that hotel on Wednesday night, having seen him there on the Thursday morning. Desmond Ryan has Treacy asking Walsh to give him a bicycle, and oddly practical in his kind of wound-up state, a waterproof coat, and they agreed where it could be collected. That source states that Walsh and Treacy had only met on one previous occasion. Given that Walsh had such an important role in the volunteers and was from Feathered, seems hard to credit. Anyway, the two Tipperary men agreed that the goods would be collected at a pub, Kerwin's in Parnell Street, and that even later than that, at 4:30, they would meet again at Phil Shanahan's. That was Thursday afternoon. According to Ryan, Treacy's biographer, Treacy's first suggestion were to meet to pick up his bike and his coat was the Republican Outfitters. Now, at this stage, one might wonder why there wasn't a big sign in the window reading, "The IRA meets here." It all seems rather crazy. So, as I say, arriving at a chronology of that fateful day is difficult. Desmond Ryan states that Walsh duly delivered a bike and coat, and that was around 11:30. Perhaps at this stage, Treacy took himself off to Mrs. Delaney's in Heytesbury Street for lunch. Now, this is southwest of Stephen's Green, and was one of the most used safe, quotation marks, houses. She subsequently was of the opinion that Treacy was being followed. Now, in all of this behaviour on Treacy's part, one can see his father's stubbornness. There's some kind of manic energy to his movements. According to Desmond Ryan, Treacy called at the premises in Parnell Street sometime after 2 o'clock, and as everyone who met him on the day attested, Treacy was preoccupied and mentioned his appointment at Walsh at 4:30, which would have had priority because if it was a way of getting weapons for the brigade, that would have been important. Putting on his newly acquired coat over the one he was already wearing and hopping on his bike, Treacy set off. Now, another piece of evidence from Harry Boland's sister, and she was in his shop in Middle Abbey Street, and she describes Treacy returning Harry's bike, whether it's the same bike or not, I don't know, just when the funeral of one of the 2 officers killed at Fernside was passing. And again, an extraordinary piece of information that apparently Treacy had told others that he had been at the funeral of the 2 officers killed. Why? I don't know. And certainly when he finally arrived at the Republican Outfitters, he approached from the railway station side of the pillar is at one end of Talbot Street and the railway station is at the other, and he approached from the railway side. He said that's why he was coming from the funeral. I don't know. With respect to witnesses, it may be that with hindsight there was a human wish to be among the last to have contact with Treacy, so trying to follow the various accounts. Nobody's telling lies, but it may be that people are telling what they wanted to make a point that they were among the last to meet him. I don't know. One of the confusing aspects is that he arrives, some places he has a bicycle, in other times the bicycle is missing. So this bicycle keeps appearing and disappearing. I don't doubt that for Treacy on that final day of his life, that Thursday, that it was the appointment at Shanahan's at 4:30 with Walsh was the crucial thing for him, and that he would not have wanted to miss that. Anyway, he for the final time, he arrived at the shop, the Republican Outfitters in Talbot Street. Of course, he was hugely concerned about Breen and wanted news. That would have been motivation for him to call there. It was very much a centre where you could meet people and find out what was going on. Now, retrospectively, concern was expressed about the amount of toing and froing by the IRA within a very limited area, and the fact that in the city there was a species of politically disengaged individuals, I'm being polite here, who kept watch for IRA members and earned a few bob by reporting to the authorities. Also, the police had their own men out, including Sergeant Frank Christian, who was known by the IRA. He was known to be intelligence and who was hovering about the street. When Treacy returned to the shop in Talbot Street after lunch, he found there Joe Vyse of the Dublin Brigade, very involved in getting weapons from Scotland. Leo Henderson and Dick McKee were already there. Henderson had taken his bike into the shop, and McKee's was left on the curb outside. They were also waiting for news about Breen, and shortly before the raid, Brunswick had called, Sean Brunswick, with news about activity in and around the Mater, where Breen was. Brunswick, in fact, had just left the shop when the raid happened. Around 4 o'clock, an armoured car and 2 lorry loads of soldiers, together with plainclothes intelligence men, came into Talbot Street from the pillar end. The convoy actually went past the shop where the IRA were. The alarm was raised in the shop. And again, not the least odd thing about these premises, there appears to have been no rear exit. Those in the shop rushed out as men from the armed convoy were coming towards them. Frank Christian, the intelligence man who was hanging about, he identified Treacy as Treacy. And as Treacy was trying to get onto McKee's bike but didn't manage it, again emphasising the foolishness of Treacy's behaviour that day, it appears that the raiding party were looking for him specifically. Christian, having been hanging about the street, had left the scene a little earlier and joined the raiding party. He now, in Desmond Ryan's words, leaped from a lorry and rushed towards Treacy, who fired. The men grappled. Treacy and rather Christian fell. The scene was one of panic and confusion as people fled from gunfire. Later reports that Christian was killed was wrong. He was wounded and got substantial compensation. Knowing that Collins's men would be out to get him, one has to like the story that on his day that his compensation case was heard in court, he arrived in an armoured car. He died in 1957. Leading the auxiliary raiding party were Major Frank Carew and Captain Gilbert Price. Carew survived and was on the IRA hit list on Bloody Sunday. He survived that also. On the 3rd of February 1921, another IRA attempt to kill him only wounded him. He died in 1943. Captain Gilbert Price was not so lucky. In the mad melee, he was shot by his own side. Also shot and killed with 2 innocent bystanders, one of whom was 15. A sacrifice for Ireland I doubt he sought. Do any of you know his name? Sean Brunswick, having just left the Republican Outfitters, was still in the vicinity, and in what seems extraordinary but also illustrates the pandemonium, he was able to return to Treacy's body lying outside Spidle's shop at number 98 Talbot Street. The Outfitters, I think, was 94, and Spidle's was a few doors up at 98. They were German pork butcher. that's actually where Treacy died. Oddly, the plaque is outside number 94, not 98. I don't know why. Brunswick managed to remove from Treacy's pockets bits and pieces, especially a notebook. That he was able to do so indicates just how confused and confusing everything was. Some of the others who were in the shop with Treacy, well, McKee appears to have gotten away. Henderson and Vise were picked up, as was somebody else who worked in the shop. Clancy and McKee, two of the names associated with the Treacy death, are also linked as two of the four men murdered while in custody on Bloody Sunday. Now, one has to regard the several reports about Treacy's death as one might take account of eyewitness accounts at a car crash. Each witness saw what he saw and fixed it in the telling over time. For example, Kevin O'Sheil, he was later a distinguished public servant. He saw it. He was in an office upstairs at number 100. But that's the same side of the street as all this was happening, so how good his view was, I don't know. But decades later, he described what he remembered seeing. He said, "In the safety of our rooms, we watched that desperate fight about 150 yards further down the street. We saw the lorry load of soldiers and an armoured car stopping outside the Republican outfitters. Suddenly a man dashed out of the shop and ran up the street. Immediately from the lorry jumped an intelligence officer named Price, who seized Treacy, for that was who the man was. A short but desperate struggle ensued, which resulted in the death of both. The military fired away indiscriminately, killing and wounding several civilians." So, is this what he actually saw, or is it what he was told about and then became a memory? I don't know. There's, of course, a famous Pathé newsreel, which you can see on YouTube. In that, you see a crowd fleeing down Talbot Street, and it's raining at the time. Now, a young Dubliner, Wilmot Irwin, was possibly in that crowd. He later described being in O'Connell Street and hearing shots from Talbot Street, and he was foolish enough to go towards the sound. And on his telling, the armoured car was shooting wildly, and so the crowd and he fled. In the Pathé film, you see the armoured car stationary behind two lorry loads of soldiers, and they're all about to depart at this stage. You see an officer with a revolver, and he directs matters, and after giving orders, he gets into the armoured car. They're pulled up outside the Republican outfitters, and you can actually read it if you look carefully at the film. Then the shot cuts to the street outside Spidles, and there's clearly one body, that of Treacy. Less clear is a second body and people standing around. There's a member of the DMP, Dublin Police. There's a chap in a trench coat who directs affairs, Dublin Castle, I suppose, and a man in a top hat and umbrella, who I think is probably a priest. And, of course, a lot of people milling about just looking. Treacy's body is brought to a lorry first, and then the other body, that of Price, and we see the convoy driving away, and it's remarkable that that film exists. Ironically, perhaps, Collins's spy in the castle, Dave Nelligan, was on hand at Dublin Castle when the lorry with the two bodies arrived. Now, that was Thursday afternoon. Sean Treacy was buried in Kilfeacle the following Monday. The body had been returned to Tipperary by train the previous day. Now, much is sometimes made of the story about some British soldiers saluting the cortege. More to the point was the hostile attitude of Wilson, the local CO at Tipperary Military Barracks, and the troops under his command. Speaking in Kilfeacle 50 years later, Treacy's cousin, Father Jim Ellis, had a point when he drew some comfort from the fact that, unlike Dinny Lacey or Liam Lynch, Sean Treacy didn't die at the hands of his own former colleagues and countrymen, but at the hands of his country's traditional enemy. What is always unsaid in the telling of this story is the question of Treacy's culpability in his own death. And so we end. Now, the Sean Treacy I've discussed is very different from that other Sean Treacy, who apparently lived only to die for Ireland and who loved his mother and couldn't wait to return to farm work, and who at best is a hook on which people hang their own needs and preconceptions. The Sean Treacy discussed in this talk is full-blooded, complicated, real, and worthy of our interest and respect precisely because of those very human qualities that he did not allow curtail his mission for his country. In fact, as I've argued, it was those same qualities that largely drove him in that work. Yes, harking back to that letter he wrote to his uncle in 1917 from Dundalk jail, Sean Treacy kept his promise about what he would do with the rest of his life. His was very much a life for Ireland.